The year 1700 marked the explosive start of the Great Northern War, a conflict destined to reshape the power dynamics of Northern Europe. A formidable coalition, including Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Saxony, had formed to challenge the supremacy of the Swedish Empire. Tsar Peter I of Russia, a man of immense ambition and vision, saw an opportunity to seize a strategic foothold on the Baltic Sea. His primary target was the fortified town of Narva, a Swedish bastion on the eastern frontier of their empire. In the autumn, a vast Russian army, numbering around 40,000 men, descended upon the unsuspecting fortress. This massive force began the arduous process of laying siege to Narva, encircling it with trenches and artillery positions. The Russian army, however, was a mixed entity of seasoned veterans and hastily conscripted, untrained peasants. Their equipment was largely outdated, and their artillery pieces were of poor quality and mismatched calibers. The Russian bombardment of the fortress proved to be largely ineffective, causing minimal damage to the sturdy Swedish defenses. As the siege dragged on into the harsh Baltic winter, conditions for the Russian soldiers deteriorated rapidly. Food was scarce, disease began to spread through the camp, and the biting cold took a heavy toll on morale. Discipline within the massive Russian host began to fray under the strain of hunger and hopelessness. Just before the climactic battle, Tsar Peter made the fateful decision to leave the army. He placed command in the hands of a foreign officer, Duke Charles Eugène de Croix, Bande de Croix. The Duke de Croix did not speak Russian and harbored deep mistrust for the soldiers he was now tasked to lead. This change in leadership sowed further confusion and resentment among the Russian officers and men. Meanwhile, Sweden's young king, the 18-year-old Charles XII, was proving to be a military prodigy. Having swiftly defeated Denmark, Charles turned his full attention to the Russian invasion in the east. He gathered his elite army, the Karelians, a force renowned for its discipline, religious fervor, and aggressive tactics. Though numbering less than 10,000, the Swedish army was a professional and highly motivated fighting machine. They undertook a perilous sea voyage and a grueling overland march to relieve the besieged fortress of Narva. The Swedish soldiers were well-equipped, well-fed, and possessed an unshakable faith in their young king. On the 30th of November, 1700, the small Swedish relief force arrived before the sprawling Russian siege lines. The sheer scale of the Russian army, stretching for miles, would have intimidated any lesser commander. But Charles XII saw not an invincible host, but a disorganized and vulnerable giant. As the Swedes prepared to attack, a sudden, freakish blizzard descended upon the battlefield. The wind howled, driving a blinding wall of snow directly into the faces of the Russian soldiers. Visibility dropped to near zero, creating an eerie, white chaos across the landscape. Charles XII immediately recognized this as a divine sign and a supreme tactical advantage. He gave the order to advance, using the storm as a cloak for his army's approach. Around 2 in the afternoon, the Swedish assault began, heralded by the muffled beat of drums. 2 powerful Swedish columns, almost invisible in the blizzard, surged towards the Russian trenches. They advanced with pikes lowered and swords drawn, a silent, unstoppable tide of blue and yellow. The Russian sentries, blinded by the snow, did not see the Swedes until they were almost upon them. The shock of the attack was overwhelming, shattering the Russian front line almost instantly. Swedish Karelians poured over the earthworks, their cold steel doing its grim work. Panic, like a contagion, spread like wildfire through the demoralized Russian ranks. The foreign officers in Russian service found it impossible to rally their men. Entire regiments dissolved into a terrified mob, each man seeking only his own survival. The Swedish army had pierced the center of the Russian line, effectively splitting their army in two. A desperate retreat began towards the only escape route, a single pontoon bridge over the Narva River. The bridge, poorly constructed and overwhelmed by the weight of the panicked horde, suddenly collapsed. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Russian soldiers were thrown into the freezing, dark waters. Their screams were lost in the roar of the blizzard and the din of battle. This disaster turned the Russian retreat into a complete and utter rout. Trapped against the river, with the relentless Swedes pressing from behind, the Russian soldiers began to surrender in droves. However, not all Russian units broke and ran. Some offered ferocious resistance. The elite Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky Guard regiments, Peter's pride, fought with disciplined courage. They formed defensive squares and repelled several Swedish charges, fighting for their honor. Their stand was a small island of order in an ocean of chaos and despair. Eventually, surrounded and vastly outnumbered by the now concentrated Swedish army, even these elite guards were forced to negotiate a surrender. Duke de Croix and the other foreign officers, fearing they would be lynched by their own men, surrendered personally to the Swedes. As night fell, the blizzard began to subside, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The entire Russian army had been shattered, its command structure dissolved, and its spirit broken. The Swedish victory was total, almost unbelievable in its scale and decisiveness. Swedish casualties were remarkably light, numbering less than 700 killed. In contrast, the Russian army had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Estimates suggest that nearly 10,000 Russian soldiers were killed or drowned. Another 20,000 were captured, including a vast number of senior officers. The Swedes seized the entire Russian artillery train, over 150 cannons. They also captured an immense supply of muskets, ammunition, and other war materials. The news of Narva sent shockwaves across Europe, cementing the reputation of Charles XII as a military genius. He was hailed as the new Alexander, a boy king who could command armies with the skill of a veteran. For Russia, the defeat was a national catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Peter the Great, upon hearing the news, was reportedly devastated but not broken. He famously declared that the Swedes would, in time, teach them how to win. The Narva catastrophe became the brutal but necessary catalyst for Peter's sweeping military reforms. Charles XII, however, made a critical strategic error in the aftermath of his stunning victory. He believed the Russian army was finished and no longer posed a serious threat. Instead of pursuing the remnants of Peter's forces into Russia, he turned his army south towards Poland and Saxony. This decision granted Tsar Peter the one thing he desperately needed: time. Peter used the following years to rebuild, re-equip, and retrain his army based on modern European standards. He melted down church bells to cast new, standardized cannons to replace those lost at Narva. The defeat instilled a harsh discipline and a thirst for revenge in the new Russian army. 4 years later, in 1704, a reformed and confident Russian army would return to Narva. This time, they would capture the fortress, reversing the humiliation of their earlier defeat. The Battle of Narva is thus remembered as a tactical masterpiece for Sweden, but a strategic turning point for Russia. It was a lesson written in blood, a lesson that Peter the Great learned with terrifying thoroughness. The road to Russia's ultimate victory at Poltava 9 years later began in the snowy, wind-swept fields of Narva. The initial Swedish assault was a textbook example of shock and awe. The Russian command structure, already fragile, disintegrated completely within the first hour. Many Russian soldiers, poorly equipped for the cold, were already suffering from frostbite. The Swedish Carolingians' faith in their king was absolute, viewing him as chosen by God. The blizzard acted as a natural smokescreen, more effective than any artillery could provide. The sound of the Swedish advance was muffled by the thick, falling snow. Russian siege lines were over 7 kilometers long, making them difficult to defend everywhere at once. Charles XII personally led one of the attacking columns, sharing the danger with his men. The psychological impact of the king's presence was a massive morale booster for the Swedes. Once the Russian line was breached, the Swedes fanned out, attacking the flanks of the broken units. The cry, "They are cutting us off," spread terror among the trapped Russian soldiers. The collapse of the Kamperholm Bridge was the point of no return for the Russian right wing. Many Russian officers were German mercenaries who were despised by their own troops. During the rout, these mercenaries were often the first to be targeted by the mutinous Russian soldiers. The Swedish army maintained its discipline even in the midst of a seemingly chaotic victory. They efficiently rounded up prisoners and secured the vast amounts of captured equipment. Garrison inside Narva, hearing the battle, was inspired to launch a sortie against their besiegers. This attack from the rear added to the confusion and panic of the Russian forces. The battle lasted only a few hours, a testament to the speed and ferocity of the Swedish assault. By nightfall, the Swedish soldiers were occupying the warm tents of their defeated enemy. The captured Russian generals were treated with courtesy by King Charles. This chivalrous behavior was part of the era's code of conduct for warfare among nobility. The common Russian soldiers, however, faced a grim fate as prisoners of war. The victory at Narva dangerously inflated the confidence of the Swedish leadership. They began to believe their army was invincible and could not be defeated. This hubris would ultimately lead to their downfall deep within Russia years later. Peter's reforms focused on creating a professional officer corps loyal to Russia. A while. He established military schools and sent promising young men to study abroad. Russian state was mobilized for war on a scale never seen before. The memory of Narva served as a constant, painful reminder of the need for modernization. The Swedish Carolingian tactic was known as GGEPPA, or Go On, emphasizing relentless offensive action. They were trained to march steadily towards the enemy, fire a single devastating volley at close range, and then charge with cold steel. This tactic required immense discipline and courage, which the Carolingians had in abundance. Against an undisciplined army like the Russians at Narva, it was devastatingly effective. The Russian army's lack of a unified command was a critical weakness. The battlefield itself, a flat and open plain, offered little natural defense for the Russians. The Swedes used their small number of cannons to support their infantry assault directly. The battle is a classic example of how a smaller, professional army can defeat a larger but less organized force. The legend of Narva would follow Charles XII for the rest of his life. It defined him in the eyes of the world, for both good and ill. The captured Russian banners were paraded through the streets of Stockholm in triumph. For the Swedish Empire, Narva represented the zenith of its military power. On this high point, the only path was downwards, towards eventual decline. The Russian prisoners were put to work in mines and on construction projects in Sweden. The sheer number of prisoners posed a logistical challenge for the small Swedish army. The battle demonstrated the vulnerability of armies reliant on foreign mercenary commanders. Peter's subsequent success was built on fostering a native, patriotic officer corps. The weather, a random act of nature, played a decisive role that no general could have planned. It was a perfect storm, in both a literal and metaphorical sense, for the Swedish cause. The Swedish soldiers' blue and yellow uniforms were a stark contrast to the white snow. Russian army's green uniforms blended in poorly with the bleak, snow-covered landscape. The battle's outcome was determined in the first 30 minutes of the Swedish charge. After the initial breach, the rest was a grim mopping-up operation. The psychological shock of the blizzard attack cannot be overstated. It felt to the Russians as if ghosts were emerging from the storm to attack them. The Swedish victory hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," was sung in the captured camp that night. The sound of their singing was a final declaration of their improbable victory. Narva was a brutal lesson in the importance of leadership, training, and morale. It was a battle that would be studied by military tacticians for centuries to come. The name Narva became a rallying cry for the Swedish army for the remainder of the war. For the Russians, it became a byword for humiliation and the need for redemption. The conflict between Charles and Peter would become a personal duel between two titans of the age. Narva was merely the opening round in a long and bloody struggle for empire. The seeds of Sweden's decline and Russia's rise were sown together in that frozen field.